over principles of freedom, equality, and secular thought and ideals, the driving force was a simple promise, or a simple premise. إن قتالنا على السماء أفقدنا الأرض. Saadi, circa 1932. The task at hand loomed large, but for those of us who have been brought up on secular thoughts and an ingrained belief that إن فيكم قوة لو فعلت لغيرت وجه التاريخ, we knew that the task is not insurmountable. The goals are indeed lofty, but our collective will and determination to bring about a better future for our new generations are unshakable. Friends, make no mistake, we truly believe that we will succeed. We cannot but succeed. I fear that the price of failure will be too steep for us to pay. We believe that education is the only path to reach a unified community. Today, you will find seated to your left or to your right every segment of the Syrian community, sharing the same table, the same food, and the same drink. Today's event is part of our educational mission. We are proud and honored to have Dr. Rashid Al-Khalidi as our speaker at this yearly event. When I first met Dr. Khalidi, it was through the screen of a TV set, actually, on a CNN program, I believe. He struck me as a well-intentioned, even-keeled national, a Palestinian-American professor that can connect to both Americans and immigrants of Syrian descent. Folks, in an age when every reporter who merely flew over Damascus or had a casual hummus or falafel has been dubbed an expert on Middle Eastern affairs, Dr. Khalidi is the real deal. Let us not be confused. Dr. Khalidi has earned his expert status over years of hard work and relentless studies. And I will allow my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Ghayas Musa, to further introduce and elaborate shortly. I would just like to take a minute of your time to acknowledge and welcome Provost Gary Richard from CSI, whose book, Deadlock and Disillusionment, American Politics Since 1968, is a wonderful read. Dr. Gary proved to be a much better writer than presidential election predictor. I told you I won't get you off the hook that easily, Doctor. I would like to thank you for, I would like to also thanks for their supposed attendance, Bishop Nicholas and Father Khudr al-Yatim. They couldn't make it with us today, or they will make it shortly later. I would like to also thank the New Generation Club Boston branch, President Mr. George Jrej and his board of trustees over there for making the trip today. Thank you very much, George. We appreciate it, you and the folks over there. They're carrying our mission in Boston, and they're doing a fantastic job. Their educational program will see them host a writer and author, also controversial writer, Alison Ware, and I'm sure the lecture will be better received in the community. Now, our future goals and objectives will see us launch a professionally produced YouTube channel. I would like for your input, or the input of the community in that matter. We're expanding our branches in South Jersey, in Miami and Jacksonville, Cleveland, Ohio, and we are eyeing several western states, including California. On the local level, we've reorganized our New York, North Jersey board and committees. Please expect more local educational and social activities. This event has been made possible by the generosity of several businesses in this community and several individual sponsors. Special thanks go to Mr. Mike Hammam, Mr. Nadim Abu Saeed, Dr. Nasim Nabbout, Mr. Fadi Ajam, and last but not least, Dr. Hassan Wahbi, one of our esteemed board of trustees and members. Dr. Wahbi, I'm not sure, I don't see you anymore, but you have been a personal inspiration, sir, and I thank you very much for your support. Special thanks go to Tannooreen's renowned chef Rawia for hosting us today. It's my understanding this is the first at Tannooreen. Hopefully it's not the end or the last. Finally, I cannot thank enough the members of the NGC board and committees that helped put this event together. I know several of them have, literally speaking, put off even their dental treatment to be able to come to this event, basically. And I'm very, very thankful to all of them for helping me out in this endeavor. Folks, thank you very, very much for being here. Without any further ado, we'll start our program. And I would introduce to you Dr. Ghayas Musa. He's going to be our MC and host today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Farha. My job is very easy. The professor that is visiting us is beyond the need to be introduced. Let me start by asking the question that Antun Saadi asked about 70 years ago. What brought all of that trouble to my nation? And he asked that question and started the discussion. What is the problem and how can we think deep enough? How can we have a dialogue and a discussion to reach the bottom of what's happening and to try to find a solution by thinking and by educating ourselves and educating each other? And this is what we're doing. Our club, the New Generation Club, and I can see plenty of the SAWA, the SAF, a lot of groups in New York and New Jersey are trying to be insistent on the dialogue as a way out into our problem, especially in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Jordan, and Palestine. All of our nation is suffering and it's divided, and the violence is ripping our nation out. So the only solution is for us to sit and discuss where is that problem coming from, to find the root of our problem and try to find a solution for it. And this is exactly what the mission of the New Generation Club. And this is why we invite important speakers, even when they are controversial. And I'm not saying Dr. Rashid is controversial, but the idea is the controversial ideas, and even if they don't agree with our opinion or they don't agree with our opinion about what's happening. But starting a discussion is the name of the game. And Dr. Rashid Al-Khalidi is a well-renowned, world-renowned figure that got his first degree from Yale and then got his PhD from Oxford. And then he went and worked in Beirut in particular. He taught in AUB and the Lebanese University. He left Lebanon in '83 with all the controversy that they thought that he is the director of the Palestinian news agency, and obviously he said no. So the controversy started there. He moved back to America. He was born in New York. And in America, he was a teacher in Columbia and then in Chicago University in Georgetown. And currently, he is the Edward Said Professor of History in Columbia. He is still the director of the Modern Middle East Study, director of International Study. Well-renowned, but the most important is that he is a talented writer. He started writing the first book, The Palestinian Identity. That started a lot of discussions, and then came the Iron Cage, came the Brokers of Deceit, a lot of various books that if you read them, you'll find out that it's not only a good read, it's a lot of discussion that can really grow our brain tremendously. The controversy about Dr. Al-Khalidi was in 2008 when, for example, Sean Hannity and a lot of people blamed that since Obama met with Rashid Al-Khalidi, then he is against Israel and he's for Palestinian. And that attack against our thinkers is all over, happening days in and days out. And we're here not to say that we are with Dr. Al-Khalidi or he is with us. We are here to hear him talking about what's happening in the era of Trump, what's happening in our neck of the town between Palestine and Syria. He's going to give us his opinion about a lot of stuff, especially about history. And most importantly, after his talk, we're going to have a room for discussion. And the discussion, as we're used to have, is going to be really polite and educated, and we're going to respect each other, although we can disagree with each other. Dr. Khalidi, please.
I've been teaching for many, many years. I started teaching in the mid-1970s. I now have grandmothers come up to me and say, I studied with you in Beirut, and I'm a little embarrassed, actually. If any of you studied with me in Beirut, please come to me later privately, and we can talk about that. And one of the things I've learned is to try and avoid coming between an audience and lunch. So I'm glad there's a little bit of food on the table. The really good food will come when we're finished. So bear with me. I'm going to talk about the Middle East in the age of Trump. I was going to talk about Palestine, and Tony Farha said to me, broaden it a little bit. This audience would like it to be a little bit broader than that. So I will talk about several aspects of the changes I think that we can expect with this administration. But I'm gonna issue a caveat at the very beginning. This is like a disclaimer. I am not a futurologist. I am a historian. The job description of a historian doesn't include predicting the future. So if I say some things about what I think will happen during the Trump administration, and I'm wrong, don't email me and say, you said so-and-so and such happened. If you'd asked me to talk about the last two administrations, I probably would have been able to analyze them because that's history, that's in the past. But I will try and give you an idea of some of the things that I think will and will not happen in the Trump administration. I think the first thing that I want to start with is to attack an illusion that many people have. Many people in the Arab world have it. Many people in our part of the world have it. Many people in the United States have it. And this is that a president changes everything. New president comes in, does exactly what he pleases. This is completely false. A president can make enormous changes. A president can have an enormous impact on policy. But there are two very powerful drags on what a president can do. This is not an Arab dictatorship, where a dictator can do whatever he wants. This is a country with institutions, with laws, and something we don't pay enough attention to, a permanent government. There are hundreds of thousands of senior officials in our country who have been working in their jobs for their entire careers in many cases. And what they do, what they say, what they want is extremely important. And it will constitute a factor that you must take into account the moment that you go into the White House. I think that we've seen a perfect example of this in President Trump's attempt to change policy on Syria. And also in President Trump's attempt to change policy on Russia. And the best example, actually, is Russia. This is a president who campaigned on a promise to improve relations with Russia. This is a country that has been at odds with Russia since 1945. We have 4 generations that have been brought up with Russia, Soviet Union, and then Russia as a major rival. We have a government which has worked generation after generation of intelligence officers, of State Department personnel, of military, of people in other departments for whom Russia has always been an adversary. We have enormously extensive defense industries who depend on this country having an enemy against which the United States has to build airplanes, ships, and so on and so forth. So there's a permanent government in this country, in addition to our laws, in addition to our traditions, in addition to all of the things that a president has to deal with, which any newcomer to the White House has to deal with. And I think that Trump is in many ways less suited to dealing with these constraints than many an American president. Most people who are elected to public office have held public office before. They have known as governors, they've known as senators, they've known as congresspeople that you have to deal with the congressional machinery, you have to deal with the government, you have the courts, you have the laws. This is a man who grew up in New York City buying politicians. He never ran a government. He never had to really deal with the nitty-gritty of making people in government do what he wanted. He bought them. That's what real estate developers do. It's one of the, I hope none of you are real estate developers. Because I'm going to say something that I might regret. It is one of the sleaziest businesses around. Because it essentially involves going around the laws, getting easements, building things in ways that might or might not fit the law, manipulating politicians so that you can use public good to your private benefit. And that's what real estate developers do. And that's all he has experience with. So he comes into office not ever having to wrestle with the bureaucracy, not ever having to wrestle with Congress, as a man who has enormous capacity as a demagogue, as a speaker, as an entertainer, someone with enormous charisma, an ability to appeal to public opinion, but absolutely no experience in dealing with government, with the day-to-day politics of government. And we have seen in less than 100 days how this president's promises to do something about American relations with Russia have gone down the tubes. I'm not going to predict that there won't be any change in American relations with Russia, but any of you who reads the papers at all, any of you who listens to the radio, or heaven forbid, watches television, will have a sense that it's very unlikely that the deep, almost permanent hostility of the United States towards Russia is unlikely to change just because Donald J. Trump is president of the United States. So I'm going to start with that as a way of talking about what might change and what might not change in the Middle East. I want to make this completely clear, because when I would travel to the Middle East, to Beirut, or to somewhere, Amman, or wherever, or Palestine, people would say to me during the Obama administration, "You know, Obama, everything's going to change, right?" And I'd say, "No, I do know Obama, or I did know Obama, but no, I doubt anything will change. Or if anything changes, it will be incremental, and it will be at the margins." And I, of course, was right. Almost nothing changed for the better in the Middle East, and much changed for the worse in the Middle East in the 8 years of the Obama presidency. That was not just because of the things I've talked about, but these are among the major reasons that this president, who had some different ideas on a number of issues, from arms control to relations with Russia, was really unable, in my view, to do very much in those areas. So I'm going to argue, firstly, that Donald Trump will change some things, but perhaps not as much as we might expect or think or like. And I'm going to start by talking about Palestine. It's very clear that this is a president who comes into office with deeper sympathy for Israel, with a deeper connection to various groups than any American president. I don't know an American president who had personal advisors who were major funders of the settlement enterprise. There never has been such a president. From Truman, who was very supportive of Israel, to Eisenhower, who was less, to Kennedy or Johnson, who were very supportive of Israel, and on through the presidents. There has never been a president, some of whose closest associates, including his son-in-law, are major sponsors of the settlement enterprise. Jared Kushner is a major funder of the colonization of Palestine. So is the person he has appointed as his Middle East negotiator. So are several other people who are already apparently going to play major roles. This is unprecedented. They've never had a president who was so close to the extreme right wing of Israeli politics. So I would expect some changes as a result of this. And we've already seen some changes as a result of this. The State Department has occasionally repeated that settlements are unhelpful, but they have refused to say that settlements are illegal. They've refused to say that settlements are an obstacle to peace. So we've already seen a change on the level of discourse, on the level of the official statements of this administration. And worse than that, we saw Prime Minister Netanyahu, when he was at the podium with the president during their joint press conference, say that as far as Palestine is concerned, he expects Israel to maintain permanent security control of the entire territory west of the Jordan River. And the president said not a thing. That means permanent occupation. That means there will never be an end to Israeli occupation of the occupied West Bank and occupied East Jerusalem, or of Israeli control, for that matter, of the Gaza Strip, which they maintain from without. This is a major change, as is the softening of the U.S. position on Palestine. I think, however, there are some limits to this. One of the limits is that this is an administration that plans to improve its relationship with a number of Middle Eastern governments. It's going to improve its relationship in particular with Saudi Arabia. Prince Mohammed bin Salman has already been to Washington, and they got on famously, apparently, the president and the deputy crown prince. This is an administration that's already improving its relations with Egypt. General Sisi, I should say President Sisi, was in Washington and was warmly received at the White House. And it's already clear that for both of these countries, the constant drumbeat of criticism on human rights and on other issues is going to stop. This administration is not going to tell the Saudis to improve the status of women. This administration is not going to tell the Egyptian government to stop torturing people. It won't say those things. And as a result, relations with these kinds of governments will improve measurably. In particular, the autocracies of the Gulf, but also clearly Egypt, Jordan, and some of the other conservative countries in the Middle East. What that means is that the administration cannot entirely ignore the interests of these countries. Now, these are countries with very good relations with Israel. Egypt and Jordan, as you know, have peace treaties with Israel. Egypt and Jordan are engaged in deep security collaboration with Israel. Egypt and Jordan have some of the same objectives as Israel. They're both hostile to Palestinian nationalism. They're both concerned about terrorism, and I could go on. The Gulf countries have a number of concerns in common with Israel. The Gulf countries, some of them in particular, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, which is more or less under Saudi control, in particular, see the world in much the same way as Israel does, see Iran as the primary threat. The Gulf countries do not consider Israel a threat, a problem, an enemy, a rival. The fact that Israel is a nuclear power doesn't bother them one bit. The only country in their environment that really concerns them is Iran. And on this, the Israeli leadership and the monarch see eye to eye. This is something that this administration will exploit. This is something that this administration will try and accelerate. This is something that I'll talk about in a minute insofar as the Palestinians are concerned. But what this means is that the administration can go only so far on the Palestine issue without embarrassing its Arab friends. These are governments which are completely out of tune with their peoples. These are not democratic countries. These are not countries which have deep popular legitimacy. These are not leaderships which depend on their people. They depend on carrots and sticks, bribery and force. And if the administration goes too far in its pandering to Israeli desires and its giving in to what the Israelis want, this will embarrass these countries in front of their own public opinion. Egyptian and Jordanian public opinion is very strongly against the treaties with Israel. The government can go only so far publicly in this respect. Even in the Gulf, where there's a deeper division on some of these issues and where there is a concern about Iran, the ability of these governments to completely expose themselves on the issue of Israel and to show themselves to be the allies of Israel or to be going along with Israel publicly is limited. And they will exert a restraining influence on the administration. They'll say, look, we see things the same way, but don't go too far with this lovey-dovey stuff with Netanyahu. Now, what does this mean for the Palestinians? This means a very bad situation for the Palestinians because it will mean even more American pressure on the Palestinians to make even more concessions. It will mean continued pressure on the Palestinians to remain divided, to prevent a unification of the different Palestinian factions, to prevent a rebuilding of the Palestinian national movement, to prevent the Palestinians from putting forward a unified national position on various issues. It will also probably mean the administration using its Arab friends to put pressure on the Palestinians, using the Saudis, using the Egyptians, using the Jordanians, using the Emiratis as tools of pressure on the Palestinians. Now, I don't know what will come of this. I have no idea exactly what the administration is going to tell the people that Abu Mazen is sending to Washington this coming week. Apparently, they're going to give them a very unpleasant set of points. I've seen one report, 9 points. They look awful. But that's just a report. It may or may not be correct. The question will be, how will the Palestinians react? And Palestinian public opinion is already quite worked up over these issues. There's strong opposition to the PA's security coordination with Israel. There were demonstrations in 16 cities. You didn't read about it if you read the New York Times, but they happened. There were demonstrations in 16 cities in the occupied West Bank against security coordination between the Palestine Authority and Israeli security services. And there will be even stronger opposition as a result of the prisoners' hunger strike. Marwan Barghouti is leading a strike of 1,500 prisoners who have refused food in a demand for better conditions, but they are people who are among the most enlightened Palestinians are the ones in prison. They're in favor of unification of Palestinian ranks. They're in favor of a number of things that are much better than either the leadership in Ramallah or the leadership in Gaza is willing to contemplate. Let me say one more thing about Palestine and also Lebanon, which is that the biggest question for me as far as Trump administration policy on Palestine is concerned is to what degree this administration will give the Israelis a green light for a new series of attacks. Israel, since 1956, has not tried to attack an Arab country without a green light from Washington. They got it in 1967. They got it when they attacked Beirut in 1982. They attacked Lebanon in 1982. They got it in every single one of their attacks on Gaza, and they got it when they attacked Lebanon in 2006. In every case, they made sure they had prior approval from Washington for what they were going to do. They maybe didn't tell them the details. In fact, Sharon told General Haig the details in 1982. We have the transcripts of the meetings. He said, I'm going to do this to Syria, I'm going to do this to the Lebanese National Movement, I'm going to do this to the PLO. And Haig said, go for it. It's sometimes much more discreet than that. In 67, it was more discreet. We have some of those documents now. They're on the historical record. They've been released either by the United States government or by the Israeli government or by others. We don't know where this issue is, but this is a thing to really be watching for. Will Washington give them a green light either for the attack that the Israelis keep talking about on Gaza or for the attack they keep talking about on Lebanon? We know that they're already carrying out attacks inside Syria. There are occasional bombardments of Gaza, but I'm talking about a major military operation, which in the case of Lebanon would be, according to what the Israelis have said, extremely devastating. So it may be that they're bluffing. It may be that they don't even intend to carry out these attacks. But if they do intend to do it, the key question will be, will the Americans let them? There was a point at which Netanyahu and his then defense secretary, Ehud Barak, were determined to attack Iran. And American disapproval stopped them. They will not do this without at least a yellow light, but most likely a green light from Washington. And I would say that's the thing to watch out for. Let me talk about other parts of the Middle East. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Gulf. I'm going to talk about the wars in the Middle East. I'm going to talk a little bit about Syria. And I'm going to conclude about Russia. So these are the last four things that I want to talk about. Let me talk first about the Gulf. People think that the most important American ally in the Middle East is Israel. This is wrong. The oldest American alliance in the Middle East, and one of the most important and oldest American alliances anywhere in the world, is with Al Saud, the ruling family of Saudi Arabia. Doesn't go back to 1945, it goes back to 1933. And it's based on an American estimation of the importance of Saudi Arabia as an oil producer, even before they started producing oil, because the geologists told them the oil was there in 33. And it goes back to an American estimation of the importance of Saudi Arabia in terms of its location, its strategic importance, and it goes back to the importance of Saudi Arabia as an influence in the region. Way back in the 30s and the 40s, this was recognized by the administration. This is the most important American ally in the Middle East. Israel is an extremely important ally. The United States is closer to Israel in many respects than it is to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the most important. Make no mistake about this. The American-Israeli connection is largely political. It's partially economic. The American relationship with Saudi Arabia is vital on the strategic level, on the economic level, in terms of the profits of a dozen of the most important corporations in the United States. Where do they sell Boeing aircraft? The Gulf. Where do they sell most of their defense equipment? The Gulf. Who owns Citibank? Talal bin Walid owns the biggest chunk of Citibank. I could go on and on and on. Go to 57th or 58th Street in Manhattan. How many of those buildings have Gulf investors? Go to Regent's Park in London. Go to the Champs-Élysées in Paris. For the Western economies, these countries are absolutely vital. It's not just the oil. It's the oil revenues and where they go. It's not just the strategic importance. It's also the influence that Saudi Arabia wields not only in its region, not only in the Arab world, not only in the Muslim world. So for this administration, this is an absolute priority. One of the things that the previous administration tried to do was to loosen relations with Saudi Arabia. There was a recognition on the part of a number of people in the administration, under Obama this is, that Saudi Arabia, for all of these strategic and economic and other considerations, has caused the United States enormous problems because of Wahhabi ideology, because of what that has led to, because of the problems that in almost every country you can think of can in many ways be traced back to an American-Saudi alliance to use Islam as a tool, first of all, against communism and against nationalism and against socialism and Abdel Nasser and so forth, and later on in Afghanistan against the Soviets, and ever since then. This is an old connection. And as far as the permanent government is concerned, this is a very good thing. Saudi Arabia is a very useful tool of influence. But the Obama administration had people in it who were a little smarter than that and could see the downside of supporting an intolerant, bigoted, narrow-minded version of Islam which targeted minorities. And as a result, they tried to separate the United States a little bit from Saudi Arabia. When I talk about the permanent government, I'm talking about the reason why this didn't happen. Why was the Obama administration almost incapable of separating the United States from Saudi Arabia? Because the permanent government is not just all of those officials who worked with the Saudis for their whole careers. It's not just a number of generals and intelligence officials and so forth. It's also these companies. When you leave the Pentagon, where do you go? You go work for Raytheon. You go work for Boeing. When you leave the intelligence service, where do you go? You go work for a security company. These companies are embedded in Saudi Arabia. These people's careers, their lives, their futures are linked to a continuation of the American-Saudi relationship. So Obama failed. He succeeded only in alienating the Saudi leadership. They really didn't like him very much. But he really did not, in any way, as far as I can tell, mitigate the negative impact that Saudi Arabia has had in a number of areas. Obviously, Yemen, I would argue also Syria and other places. The Saudi impact has been, in my view, extremely negative. Let me talk a little more about the Gulf in terms of one other thing, which is this connection to Israel. One of the concerns that this administration apparently has is that they don't have enough leverage on the Palestinians. They're not able to squeeze the Palestinians quite enough, because they're not planning to squeeze the Israelis, I promise you. And the financial weight, the might of countries like the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and so forth, are something that they are counting on if the president, in fact, really intends to make a deal, as he says he does. That's not going to be a deal that's going to be based on equity. It's not going to be a deal that's based on justice. It's not going to be a deal that's based on Security Council resolutions. That's going to be a deal that's based on forcing the weaker party to capitulate to the demands of the stronger party. And to make the Palestinians do that, one of the key elements is going to be Saudi Arabia and its allies in the Gulf. So this is a relationship that will improve significantly under Trump, in my view. I think that it's a relationship that's already improved. Just read what Mohammed bin Salman, the deputy crown prince, said when he left Washington. He was a happy man when he flew back to the kingdom. And I think we're going to see more Gulf leaders come to Washington and go away with grins from here to here on their faces. And part of what they're going to be asked to do is to help the administration, if it ever decides to go ahead with a deal on the Palestine issue. I promise you, if they try and do this, they will probably fail. If they succeed, the deal will have no sustainability. It won't last. You can force the Palestinians into a bad deal, but you can't force the Palestinian people to capitulate. And I think that if they do this, it will not be ultimately successful. Let me talk now about wars in the Middle East. And I think that what I said about the permanent government applies to the previous administration, and I believe will apply to this administration. Obama was elected in 2008 in part because he was seen as an anti-war candidate. He opposed the war in Iraq. He thought that it was time to end the war in Afghanistan, and he said that he was going to do those two things. You may have noticed that he didn't. You may have noticed that the war in Afghanistan is exactly as bad as it was 8 years ago, and that the war in Iraq is still going on. The battle for Mosul is still going on as we speak. And even if Mosul falls, even if the Iraqi government takes it, the war is not over in Iraq. There's a civil war in Iraq. There's a proxy war in Iraq. Those wars are not over. And American involvement in those wars is not likely to end. So my point is, even if this president was elected in part on the basis of his criticism of the wars that Obama had allowed to continue. My guess is those wars will continue. And the reason for this, there are many reasons for this. One of them is that we have a permanent government. We have people who are deeply invested in this, and the generals are going to say, well, a little more of this, a little more of that, as they did to Obama. When he said, I want to decrease troop levels in Iraq, they said, you can't do that. He did it a little bit. In the end, the United States is still sending troops back to Iraq, is now sending troops, as we know, to Syria. So I would argue that because of these vested interests, Trump is not going to be any more successful than the last president was in ending the American involvement in these wars. Let me talk now a little bit about Syria. This is a problem. This is a problem for those of us who are involved in Palestinian solidarity, because it is something that has caused deep divisions, not just among the rest of our community, but among Palestinians as well. What we have in Syria is a civil war. We have a proxy war as well. In other words, it's not just Syrians fighting Syrians. There are 12 or 14 countries that are up to their eyeballs in supporting different factions, in some cases involved directly militarily. Several Western powers, several Gulf powers, several other powers, Turkey, and so on and so forth, Israel. And this is a war that is more cruel even than the Iraq War, which was more cruel than the Lebanese Civil War. I lived in Beirut from the late 1960s when I was still an undergraduate. My mother moved back to Beirut. All the period I was doing my doctorate at Oxford, I was living in Beirut and doing research there, and for the next many years until 1983. So we lived through the Civil War from the early 70s, mid-70s, until 1983. And we had 3 children in that period. I know what war is like. I know what that war is like. This is infinitely worse. I mean, we suffered, the Lebanese people suffered enormously, the Palestinians in Lebanon suffered enormously, but the suffering that's going on in Syria is of an order of magnitude much, much greater. All of you know this. Many of you may have family there. You know it better than I do. I have family too in Syria, but many of you have more family, I'm sure, than I do. This is a conflict that has brought no glory and no honor to the United States. The United States didn't start this, but the United States has played a role in keeping it going and has failed to end it. One of the things that you have to say is this is the greatest superpower in the history of the world. This is the most important power in the Middle East since the end of the Cold War, the only superpower in the Middle East. And it has had almost no, in my view, positive effect on the conflict of Syria, and in many ways has had a negative effect. There are many, many reasons for this. But I'm sorry to tell you that I do not expect this administration to make any major changes in my view, failed policies of the previous administration in Syria. I wish I could say, something different. I wish I could say the United States would act decisively, one way or another, would change its policy in some significant way. It will change its policy. The president, by attacking a Syrian airbase, has already directly involved the United States in this war in a way that it had never been involved before. But I don't think that constitutes a major shift, and I probably will be proven wrong, but I'm going to say I don't think that there is going to be a major change in this administration's policy in Syria. And I'll give you 2 or 3 reasons for that. One of them I've already alluded to, which is that there are powerful forces within the bureaucracy that are forces of inertia and that are not going to respond easily to a radical change that a president is trying to bring about. But there are other reasons, and these have to do with some of the things I've just been talking about. Think about the closest allies of the United States in the Middle East: Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Israel, Jordan, Egypt, the Emirates, Qatar. All of these countries are deeply involved in the Syrian war. In some cases, they are financing the war to the tune of billions of dollars. In other cases, like Turkey, they actually have forces inside Syria. I could go on and on and on. In addition, you have the American-Iranian rivalry, which this administration has promised to ratchet up. This administration has promised to put more pressure on Iran. It's criticized the nuclear agreement with Iran. It probably won't pull out of it. Again, that's the inertia that the permanent bureaucracy will provide. But it will make American-Iranian relations much, much, much more conflictual, much, much more hostile. And that is a factor in guaranteeing almost that you will have virtual immobility in American policy on Syria. If there's a change, there'll be a change only at the margins, which is bad news in my view for Syria. Because even though I don't think the United States is the only external party that's responsible for this mess, it is the biggest country. It's the biggest boy on the block. And it has played a role that does not bring any credit, in my view, on the United States. Let me say a couple words about Iran, and then I'll finish by talking about Syria. I have a feeling from looking at you that you might have 1 or 2 questions, so I'll save a little bit of time for questions before I finish. The issue of Iran is as deeply tied up with vested interest in this country as any issue that there is. It's an issue on which the Israel lobby is working night and day. As far as they're concerned, given the orientation of the Netanyahu government, given their proclivities, this is something that they want to hammer on every single day. Iran is an inveterate, unchangeable enemy of the United States. The United States must continue to be utterly hostile to Iran. If Netanyahu and Barak had succeeded in getting Israel into a war with Iran, I promise you, the lobby would have tried to drag us into that war behind them. They were already working in that direction. And one of the things that Obama said to people in Congress was, this is my policy. The alternative is war. Would you please come and say, I want a war with Iran? Go out and say it. Go ahead and say it. If you're willing to say that, I will change my policy. He shut them up. Because any of them, however opportunistic, however susceptible to influence of the Israel lobby, however cowardly, they know what the military say. The military say that a war with Iran would make Iraq and Afghanistan look like picnics. Iran is a fortress in terms of its geography. Iran is a country that has a powerful industrial base, a very large military, that's fought wars. These are not amateurs. They fought a war with Iraq. They've been engaged indirectly in the Iraqi war. They're engaged in the Syrian war indirectly. They're people who have experience. The military taking on Iran would be a nightmare. And the professionals told that to the president. I don't know that from Obama. I haven't spoken to him in 8 years. But I know that. And the president forced that on the Republicans, and they shut up. They just put their tails between their legs. They turned around. And the idea of the United States actually confronting Iran militarily disappeared during the Obama administration. Even if this president tries to push us in that direction, even if Netanyahu tries to start something, which I actually don't expect, because the Israeli military and the Israeli intelligence services have the same opinion. A war with Iran would be a disaster for Israel, not just for the United States. Nevertheless, they will increase hostility to Iran, and I'm afraid that may exacerbate things in Syria. Because I think that this is a policy vis-a-vis Iran that's irrational. It fosters the worst elements in Iranian politics, and we have a presidential election coming up in Iran very soon. And the potential of a aggressive American posture towards Iran is that it will negatively impact domestic Iranian politics. And that, in turn, will have an effect in Iraq, it will have an effect in Syria, it will have an effect in the Gulf, it will have an effect in Yemen, because those are areas that the Iranians will push back. So let me conclude by talking about Russia. And you may say, well, what does Russia have to do with, Trump policy on the Middle East? And I actually think that Russia has a great deal to do with Trump policy on the Middle East. What Trump will end up doing will in part depend on what will happen in the American-Russian relationship. If the American-Russian relationship continues to be defined by the neoconservatives, by the War Party, which includes people ranging from right-wing Republicans to Hillary Clinton, people who are hostile to Russia, people who have very much supported the expansion of NATO into the former Soviet sphere in Eastern Europe, people who are eager advocates of regime change against pro-Russian governments in places like the Ukraine. If those people continue to have the upper hand, then our relations with Russia will not improve. And we will continue to be on a confrontational path with Russia in areas like Syria. Trump, for all of his inexperience in foreign affairs, actually came with an idea that I think was not foolish. I am not a supporter of Donald Trump, so what I'm about to say may fly in the face of your expectations. But what he originally said about trying to reset relations with Russia probably was a smart thing. Now, what the Russians did in our elections, or tried to do, what the Trump administration or the Trump campaign team foolishly may have done in terms of what they said to the Russians, may have jeopardized this entire attempt on the part of the administration. These are people with no experience whatsoever in foreign policy. Trump, he may have traveled to some of his Trump hotels around the world, but he literally knows less about foreign policy than any person who's ever served as president of the United States since the Cold War began. Franklin Roosevelt had been Secretary of the Navy. Franklin Roosevelt was a man who knew the world. Truman Even Truman had served in Europe in World War I. He was a captain in artillery. President Eisenhower had commanded all Allied forces in Europe in World War II, and so on and so forth. John F. Kennedy had fought in the South Pacific. His father was ambassador to Britain. He traveled to Palestine and wrote an amazing report for his father when his father was ambassador, talking about what the Zionist movement was doing in Palestine. This was a man these are people who actually had deep personal experience of foreign affairs before they became president. President Carter had been a captain of a nuclear submarine. He traveled all over the world. I could go on and on. Clinton is one of the American presidents who had the least foreign experience. This man has less. And so it was a coincidence that he came to this conclusion, I think. But it was not an incorrect conclusion. Now, will he be able, in the face of this powerful, powerful inertia within our bureaucracy, in the face of all of the political groups, all of the interest groups that really don't want any change in American policy towards Russia, to change that policy? I'm pessimistic. But if he is able to do anything in this regard, it may have a positive impact on the Middle East. Why is this? This is because I'm a historian, among other things, of the Cold War. And the Cold War was terrible for the Middle East. But the Cold War prevented a number of kinds of conflicts because of direct involvement by the superpowers, because there was sort of mutual deterrence. They were a little bit afraid of each other, and so their direct involvement was very limited. The moment the Cold War ended in 1990-91, the United States went to war in the Middle East. And it's been at war in the Middle East ever since then. Most American forces abroad are now in the Middle East, and that's been the case since 1991. For 28 years, 27 years, the United States has been up to its neck in the Middle East. And that's partly because there was no rival, there was no pushback. There are other aspects of the Cold War. There were some ways in which the superpowers were able to broker arrangements and agreements. Now, I'm not saying the United States and Russia will be able to do what the United States and the Soviet Union occasionally were able to do during the Cold War. But if there is a chance of their doing that, this is not something that the peoples of the region are necessarily going to love. This is not necessarily something that represents what we want, or you want, or any of us wants. But it might put a cap on some of these conflicts. It might put a limit on some of these conflicts. I was not living in Lebanon when the Ta'if agreement was secured. But I can tell you that post-Ta'if, the fighting stopped. I can tell you that today Beirut is better than it was before 1990, before the Ta'if agreements. If a similar kind of agreement, whatever its nature, is possible in Iraq, if a similar kind of agreement is possible in Yemen, if a similar kind of agreement is possible in Libya, if a similar kind of agreement is possible, most importantly, in Syria, whatever, leaving aside the specific nature of it, that might be brokered by these external powers, in particular Russia and the United States, that probably would be better than the continuation of this bloodletting, of these civil wars, of these proxy wars where every half-bit country with an intelligence service and $100 million worth of weapons to dump can start a war. The war in Libya involves, among many other things, the British and the Qataris on one side using Libyans to fight the Emiratis and the Egyptians on the other side. Part of the war in Libya is between the British and the French and the Emiratis and the Qataris. I mean, a greater disgrace than that is unimaginable. That these two countries, they're allies, Britain and France. The Qataris and the Emiratis don't differ on anything. It's just in my view, a tragedy. Anything that could bring that kind of mahzari, that kind of tragic foolishness to an end is better than the status quo. So I'm not banking on the Trump administration. I'm not banking on the Russians. But if there is going to be a chance of bringing any one of these 5 bloody, miserable civil wars plus proxy wars to an end, that might be the chance. Now, this is probably the most unpredictable president that we've had in my lifetime that I'm aware of. He could do almost anything. He is capable of almost anything, especially at 5 in the morning, after he gets up and he starts working on his Twitter feed. He's changed policy a half-dozen times in less than 100 days. I don't expect that we're going to get predictability from him at any time in the near future. So even if he does something that changes things for the better in any one of these areas that I've talked about, the possibility of somebody else talking to him, say down at Mar-a-Lago or when his son-in-law comes to visit him, or when he meets another one of these real estate billionaires. I was looking at the New York Times this morning, and there were pictures of the people who advised Trump privately. Two of them are real estate moguls just like him, LeFrak and I forget the other one. What do these people know about the world? They don't know anything. But these are the people that the president listens to. So literally anything could happen, and some of it may not be very good. If, at the very least, in terms of some of these conflicts, he is able, whether intentionally or unintentionally, to limit these conflicts, it will probably be a good thing. As far as Palestine is concerned, I expect nothing good. I expect more bad news. Even if there's no new assault on Gaza, I expect more bad news. We are very unfortunate in having very, very, very weak leadership among the Palestinian people. Our best leaders are either dead or in jail. It's not a good position to be in. We have a divided Palestinian movement. We have a people, more than half of whom are in exile from Palestine, and then inside Palestine divided up. Those in Gaza are in prison, those inside Israel, those inside Jerusalem, those inside the West Bank, all separated in different ways from one another. Nevertheless, if you read the Israeli press, they realize that they haven't won. They haven't completed this process of taking over and absorbing the entirety of Palestine, and they haven't done that because of the resilience and the sumud, the steadfastness of the Palestinians. And I see no reason to expect that won't continue. The Palestinians have put up with people from Truman all the way to Obama. I think they'll survive Trump as well. Thank you very much.